It had only been 4 hours since my son-in-law left on his business trip. When my granddaughter came home from school, her eyes were puffy and red from crying. She barely whispered to me, "Grandma, please take me away from here. I'm scared of my dad." When we arrived at my place, she handed me a recording on her phone. My legs gave out when I listened to it. It turns out that all this time, my son-in-law had been doing unspeakable things to my precious granddaughter. I was walking down the familiar tree-lined street in Charlotte, the heavy canvas grocery bag weighing down my arm despite the comfortable autumn weather. It was only 8:30 inches the morning, and the North Carolina sun was already warming the sidewalk, making me grateful I'd worn my light cardigan instead of something heavier. I was heading to my daughter Naomi's house, which was just 4 blocks from my own small brick home in the same quiet neighborhood where I'd lived for the past 30 years, ever since my husband Robert and I had moved here from South Carolina, looking for better opportunities. The white front door with its brass knocker opened easily when I turned the key. Naomi had given me years ago, back when she'd first bought this house with Andre, her first husband. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a television left on somewhere upstairs, probably in the master bedroom, where someone had forgotten to turn it off before leaving. Darnell, my son-in-law, stood in the middle of the living room in a crisp navy business suit, his hair slicked back with that expensive gel he always used, his leather briefcase sitting next to the cream-colored sofa like a faithful companion ready for travel. He looked at me and gave me one of those tight, controlled smiles that I'd never quite trusted, though I'd tried to convince myself over the past 2 years that I was just being an overprotective grandmother, that I was seeing problems where none existed. "Clara, good morning. Thanks for coming over," he said in that smooth voice of his, the one that sounded polite and professional, but always felt slightly rehearsed, like he was delivering lines he'd practiced. "Could you look after the house and pick up Jasmine from school these next few days? I'm leaving for a pharmaceutical conference in Atlanta. Should be gone about 5 days, maybe 6 if the final meetings run long." I nodded, already familiar with this routine that had become all too common over the past 2 years since Darnell had married my daughter. Darnell traveled frequently for his job in pharmaceutical sales, visiting doctors' offices and hospitals across the Southeast. And since Naomi was buried under the demands of her nursing career at Carolinas Medical Center, working long 12-hour shifts that often stretched into overtime when the emergency room got busy, they frequently left Jasmine, my precious granddaughter, in a house that felt too large and too empty for a child to be alone in, even for a few hours after school. Jasmine was only 9 years old, a bright-eyed girl with cornrowed hair that I helped her braid every Sunday afternoon while we watched old movies together and ate popcorn. She was the daughter of Naomi and Andre, my daughter's first husband, a good man who'd made some bad choices with gambling that had eventually destroyed their marriage. By this time of morning, Jasmine had surely already left for Highland Creek Elementary School, walking the 3 blocks with her yellow backpack covered in pins and patches she'd collected, and her lunchbox decorated with cartoon characters from that show she loved. I asked Darnell a few questions about what food he'd left in the refrigerator for Jasmine, whether she had clean school uniforms pressed and ready, and I took the opportunity to ask how Naomi was handling the stress of her rotating shifts at the hospital, the exhaustion I'd seen in my daughter's eyes the last time we'd had coffee together. But Darnell only answered in short, clipped sentences, constantly glancing at the expensive silver watch on his wrist, that designer brand he was always so proud of. The one he'd mentioned cost more than most people's monthly rent. "The Uber is waiting outside. Traffic to the airport is going to be terrible this time of morning," he said, grabbing his briefcase and rolling suitcase with an efficiency that suggested he couldn't wait to leave, couldn't get out of this house fast enough. I walked him to the door and watched the black sedan pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner at the end of the street, heading toward Interstate 85 and the airport beyond. I went back inside, closed the door with its familiar click, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that always settled in my stomach when I was alone in this house, though I couldn't quite explain why it bothered me so much. The house was tidy in that sterile way that suggested a professional cleaning service rather than the lived-in warmth of a real home where children played and families gathered. Everything was in its place, almost too perfectly arranged. I started tidying up the kitchen anyway, finding comfort in familiar tasks that connected me to the generations of women in my family who'd found peace in caring for their homes. Breakfast dishes were still piled in the sink, remnants of cereal and orange juice, and a couple of Jasmine's school shirts were sitting in the laundry basket by the washing machine, waiting to be washed. I gathered everything, started a load of laundry with the fabric softener that Jasmine liked because it made her clothes smell like lavender, and opened the windows to let in the cool autumn air that smelled of fallen leaves and approaching winter, that particular scent that always reminded me of new beginnings and the turning of seasons. Around 11, I sat down to rest on the living room sofa with a glass of sweet tea, the Southern staple I could never give up, no matter how many doctors told me to watch my sugar intake. The image of Jasmine came to mind, as it so often did throughout my days. That little girl was my greatest joy, my reason for getting up in the morning since my husband Robert had passed away 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack that had left me a widow at 57. With her radiant smile and those intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, that noticed details other children missed, my heart felt lighter every time I picked her up from school and heard her chattering about her day, about the books she was reading or the science projects she was working on. It was as if my own youth returned with every story she told me about her friends, her teachers, the things she was learning. But lately, over the past 6 months really, I had noticed that Jasmine was talking less and less. Her smiles were growing scarcer, replaced by long silences and a haunted, distant look in her eyes that no 9-year-old should ever have. A look that reminded me of trauma survivors I'd seen on television documentaries. I told myself that maybe it was just because she was getting older, entering that difficult pre-adolescent phase where children start to withdraw into themselves and pull away from the adults who love them. Or maybe, I'd reasoned with myself during sleepless nights when worry kept me awake, she hadn't fully adjusted to Darnell yet, even though he'd been married to Naomi for 2 years now, even though he'd been living in that house and playing the role of stepfather since Jasmine was only 7 years old. The girl still loved Andre, her biological father, with a fierce devotion that sometimes broke my heart. Even though Andre wasn't around much in her and Naomi's life anymore, even though his gambling debts and financial irresponsibility had forced him to move across the state to Raleigh, where he was working 2 jobs trying to pay back what he owed, Jasmine talked about him constantly, asked when he was coming to visit, saved drawings and school papers to show him. Andre had struggled with his demons, that was true, but he'd never been anything but loving and gentle with Jasmine. He saw her maybe once every 2 months now, making the long drive from Raleigh when he could afford the gas and had a weekend off from both his jobs, and I knew Jasmine counted down the days until his visits like other children counted down to Christmas. The divorce had been hard on her, harder than Naomi wanted to admit. My daughter had been so focused on moving forward, on building a new life with Darnell, on his stable income and professional success, that she hadn't fully acknowledged how much Jasmine was still grieving the loss of her father's daily presence. In the afternoon, around 2:30, I took my canvas tote bag and my reading glasses, locked up Naomi's house, and walked the 6 blocks to Highland Creek Elementary School, enjoying the autumn sunshine and the sight of Halloween decorations already appearing in neighbors' yards, even though it was only early October. The schoolyard was a sea of people when I arrived, with parents and grandparents and nannies huddled in small groups, and the buzz of children's voices sounding like a flock of birds preparing for migration. I stood in my usual corner near the flagpole, my eyes fixed on the stream of students flowing out through the double doors. Other children ran and jumped with that boundless energy only the young possess, showing off their artwork to their parents, laughing and chatting with their friends with excitement about some upcoming field trip or class party, their voices high and carefree. but I waited and waited, scanning every face, and Jasmine didn't appear. A knot began to form in my stomach, that grandmother's intuition that something was wrong, that feeling that had never led me astray in all my 65 years. I stood on my tiptoes, trying to see over the crowd of adults and the sea of colorful backpacks. Finally, when the rush of children had slowed to a trickle and the schoolyard was starting to empty, I saw her come out last of all, walking alone while other children ran past her in groups. Her heavy backpack hung from one thin shoulder, looking like it might topple her over. Her head was bowed so low her chin almost touched her chest, and she walked so slowly, dragging her feet as if she were carrying the weight of the whole world on her small back, as if every step required enormous effort. "Jasmine," I called out, waving my hand, trying to catch her attention over the remaining noise of the schoolyard. The girl flinched at the sound of her name, actually flinched like she'd been struck, looked up for just a second with startled eyes, and then immediately looked back down at the pavement. When she got closer, weaving between the last few parents collecting their children, I felt my heart literally skip a beat. Her face was pale, unnaturally so, with a grayish tinge that spoke of sleepless nights. Her eyes were red and puffy and swollen, as if she'd been crying for hours, maybe even days. Her usual innocent smile, the one that had always lit up her whole face and made her eyes crinkle at the corners, was completely gone, replaced by an exhausted, haunted expression that made her look years older than her age. "Jasmine, baby, what's wrong?" I asked, immediately kneeling down to her level despite the protest from my arthritic knees, taking both her small hands in mine. "Did something happen at school today? Did someone hurt you? Did you get in trouble?" My voice was trembling with worry and something else, something darker that I didn't want to name, a fear that was starting to creep into my consciousness. Jasmine only shook her head without saying a single word, her lips pressed tightly together, as if she was afraid that if she opened her mouth, something terrible would come spilling out that she could never take back. Her hands were ice cold in mine despite the warm afternoon temperature, despite the jacket she was wearing. I wanted to ask her more, wanted to demand answers, wanted to know what had stolen the light from my granddaughter's eyes. But seeing the empty, traumatized look on her face, seeing the way she was trembling like a leaf in a storm, I chose to swallow my questions for now. I squeezed her hands tightly, trying to pour warmth and safety and love into her through that simple touch, and led her to the bus stop near the school, the one that would take us back to Naomi's neighborhood. During the whole ride back, Jasmine sat pressed against me, hugging her backpack like it was a life preserver, and she was drowning, not saying a word, not responding to any of my gentle attempts at conversation. To everything I asked, whether about her classes or her lunch or her friends, she only nodded or shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor of the bus, watching the gum stains and scuff marks as if they held the secrets of the universe. The other passengers, sensing something was wrong, gave us sympathetic looks, but didn't intrude. The unease inside me grew and grew with every block we traveled, like a heavy stone pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't just a bad day at school. This wasn't just childhood moodiness or pre-adolescent hormones. Something was deeply, terribly wrong with my granddaughter, and every grandmother instinct I possessed was screaming at me to pay attention, to not let this go, to dig deeper no matter how uncomfortable it made me. By the time we reached Naomi's house, I had made a decision. I wasn't taking Jasmine there. Not today. Maybe not ever again until I understood what was happening. Instead, I kept her hand firmly in mine and walked right past Naomi's white door with its brass knocker, continued down the 4 blocks to my own small brick house, the home where Jasmine had always felt safe, where we'd baked cookies and watched movies and talked about everything and nothing. The door to my house closed behind us with a soft click, and the familiar sound seemed to release something in Jasmine. She let out a long, shaky breath, but still didn't speak, still clutched that backpack like her life depended on it. I told her gently to take off her shoes, trying to keep my voice calm and normal, even though inside I was anything but calm, my heart racing with worry and a growing dread I couldn't name. Jasmine just stood there in my small entryway, not moving, not responding, clutching her backpack so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. I went to the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I prepared a cup of hot chocolate, the kind with marshmallows that Jasmine had always loved, and placed it in front of her at my dining table, the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. Steam rose from the cup, swirling in the afternoon light coming through the window, but Jasmine didn't touch it. She just sat there, her gaze lost somewhere far away, fixed on some point on the floor that only she could see, as if the weight of the entire world was pressing down on her thin, small shoulders. I pulled up a chair and sat right next to her, close enough to touch but not crowding her, giving her space if she needed it. I put a gentle hand on her shoulder and spoke to her in the softest voice I could muster, the voice I'd used when she was a baby and I'd rocked her to sleep. "Jasmine, sweetheart, tell Grandma what happened at school today. Did someone make you feel bad? Did a teacher say something that hurt your feelings? Did you have a fight with one of your friends?" I tried to smile, hoping my familiar face, the face that had loved her since the moment she was born, would encourage her to open up and talk to me. But Jasmine just shook her head slowly from side to side, pressing her lips together even tighter, so tight they'd lost their color. Her little hands clutched the backpack strap with such force that I could see her knuckles turning white, see the tendons standing out in her small wrists. I wanted to insist, wanted to demand answers, wanted to shake the truth out of whatever darkness was consuming her. But seeing her red and swollen eyes, seeing the way her whole body was tensed like a frightened animal ready to bolt, I held back. Something was very, very wrong. I knew it in my bones, in that deep maternal instinct that had guided me through 65 years of life. But I didn't want to force her to talk if she wasn't ready, didn't want to make whatever trauma she was experiencing even worse. Suddenly, as if something inside her had finally broken apart, as if a dam that had been holding back a flood had suddenly cracked, Jasmine let out a sharp, piercing cry and burst into tears. Her sobbing was violent and desperate, each sob tearing through the quiet of my house like a knife plunging into my grandmother's heart. She started to tremble, her whole body shaking uncontrollably, her shoulders heaving with the force of her crying, and between choked sobs that made it hard for her to breathe, she managed to say a few broken, terrifying words. "Grandma, get me out of here, please. I'm really, really scared of my dad." Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet I almost couldn't hear it over the sound of her crying, but every word felt like it was burning itself into my soul, leaving scars that would never fully heal. "Dad? You mean Darnell? What are you scared of, baby? Tell Grandma. Whatever it is, I'll protect you. I promise." I tried desperately to stay calm, to be the rock she needed, but my voice was already trembling despite my best efforts, and my heart was pounding so hard in my chest, I thought it might burst through my ribs. Jasmine shook her head frantically, violently, as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks, soaking the collar of her school uniform. "I don't want to be in that house anymore, Grandma. I don't want to be there when Mama's at work. Please don't make me go back. Please." She threw her arms around me, hugging me with a desperation I'd never felt from her before, burying her face in my chest, and I felt her warm, ragged breath against my blouse, felt her small body shaking with terror and trauma. I wrapped my arms around her tightly, pulling her close, patting her back with automatic, soothing motions, while my mind raced through horrible possibilities. "You're safe now, baby. You're with Grandma. Nobody's going to hurt you here. I promise you're safe." But even as I said the words, trying to comfort her, I felt my own fear rising like bile in my throat. Darnell. The man I thought was a decent stepfather, a stable presence in my daughter's life, someone who provided for them financially and seemed respectable and professional. What had he done? What had this man, who smiled his tight smiles and wore his expensive suits and traveled for business, What had he done to my precious granddaughter? The look of absolute panic in Jasmine's eyes, the terror that no 9-year-old could possibly fake, told me everything and nothing all at once. This wasn't about a stern punishment or a harsh word. This was something darker, something that made my stomach turn and my hands shake. Jasmine, baby, I need you to tell me what happened. I know it's hard. I know you're scared, but Grandma needs to know so I can help you. Did Darnell hurt you? Did he hit you? The words felt like poison coming out of my mouth, but I had to ask, had to know. Jasmine pulled back slightly, her tear-stained face looking up at me with eyes that held more pain than any child should ever experience. She reached into her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out her phone, a simple smartphone that Naomi had given her for emergencies, for calling if she needed a ride or if there was a problem. I recorded it, Grandma, she whispered, her voice breaking. Last week when Mama was working the night shift, I hid my phone under my pillow and pressed record. I was so scared he'd find it, but I had to. I had to have proof because Mama doesn't believe me. My blood ran cold. Your Mama knows? You told your Mama and she didn't believe you? The betrayal I felt on Jasmine's behalf was almost as strong as my fear for her safety. Jasmine nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I tried to tell her 3 months ago. I said that Darnell comes into my room at night when she's at work, that he touches me in bad places, that he makes me do things. But she got so angry, Grandma. She said I was lying, that I was trying to ruin her marriage because I want Daddy Andre back. She said I was being a spiteful child who couldn't accept that she'd found happiness again. I felt like the floor had opened up beneath me, like I was falling into an abyss of horror and rage and grief. My own daughter, my Naomi, had been told by her child that she was being abused, and instead of protecting her, instead of investigating, instead of believing her own flesh and blood, she'd called her a liar. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process it. "Give me the phone, baby," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Let me hear what you recorded." Jasmine handed me the phone with shaking hands. I pressed play, and what I heard in the next 3 minutes destroyed whatever illusions I'd had about Darnell, about my daughter's judgment, about the safety of my granddaughter. The recording was dark and muffled, clearly taken from under a pillow as Jasmine had said, but the audio was clear enough. I heard a door opening. I heard footsteps crossing the room. I heard Jasmine's small voice, tight with fear, saying, "Please don't. Please, I don't want to." And then I heard Darnell's voice. That smooth voice I'd heard that very morning, but now it was different, darker, filled with a sick anticipation that made my skin crawl. "Shh, Jasmine. You know this is our special time. Your Mama's at work. Nobody's going to know. And if you tell anyone, they won't believe you anyway. Your Mama certainly didn't believe you last time, did she? So just be a good girl and do what I say." His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it even more horrifying. This was practiced. This was routine. This monster had been doing this for God knows how long. The recording continued with sounds that I will never be able to erase from my mind. Jasmine crying softly, pleading, Darnell giving instructions in that calm, matter-of-fact voice. The sounds of movement, of a child being violated in her own bedroom while her mother worked to pay the bills. I pressed stop, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. My legs gave out and I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from collapsing completely. I felt bile rising in my throat, felt a rage so pure and hot it was like molten metal flowing through my veins. "How long?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. "How long has this been happening, Jasmine?" She looked down at her lap, her voice so small I had to lean in to hear. "Since Mama married him. Since I was 7. It started with him coming in to say goodnight, but then he'd sit on my bed and touch my hair, my face. Then he started touching other places. Then he started making me touch him. Then it got worse. 2 years. For 2 years, this monster had been abusing my granddaughter, And I hadn't known. I hadn't seen it. I'd been 4 blocks away, living my quiet life, thinking everything was fine, while my baby was being tortured in her own home. The guilt crashed over me like a wave, but I pushed it aside. There would be time for guilt later. Right now, I needed to act. "Jasmine, listen to me very carefully," I said, taking her face gently in my hands and looking directly into her eyes. "What Darnell did to you is wrong. It's a crime. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? You did nothing wrong." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "But Mama said I was lying. She said I was trying to break up her marriage." "Your mama was wrong," I said firmly, feeling an anger toward my daughter that I'd never experienced before. "She was so very wrong, baby. And she's going to have to live with that mistake for the rest of her life. But right now, we need to get you help. We need to make sure you're safe. And we need to make sure Darnell never hurts another child again." I pulled out my own phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. When the operator answered, I took a deep breath and said, as calmly as I could manage, "I need to report child sexual abuse. I have a recording as evidence. My 9-year-old granddaughter has been assaulted by her stepfather for the past 2 years." The operator's voice became immediately serious and focused. "Ma'am, where is the child now? Is she safe?" "She's with me. She's safe. The perpetrator is out of town on a business trip. He won't be back for 5 days. Ma'am, I'm dispatching officers to your location right now. I'm also going to connect you with a specialized detective from our Crimes Against Children unit. Please don't let the child bathe or change clothes. We'll need to document everything." The next few hours were a blur of police officers, questions, procedures, and protocols. 2 uniformed officers arrived first, a woman named Officer Martinez and a man named Officer Thompson. They were gentle with Jasmine, speaking to her in soft voices, but I could see the rage in their eyes when they understood what had happened. A detective arrived shortly after, a woman in her 40s named Detective Sarah Williams, who specialized in child abuse cases. She sat down with Jasmine in my living room, with me right beside her holding her hand, and asked questions in the gentlest way possible. Jasmine, with incredible bravery, told her everything. Every incident she could remember. Every time Darnell had come into her room. Every threat he'd made. Every time she'd tried to tell her mother and been dismissed. Detective Williams listened to the recording, her face growing harder and more determined with every second. "This is clear evidence," she said quietly. "Combined with Jasmine's testimony and a medical examination, we'll have more than enough to arrest and prosecute." The medical examination. The words sent a chill through me. "You mean at a hospital?" I asked, holding Jasmine closer. "We have a special center," Detective Williams explained. "The Child Advocacy Center. It's designed specifically for these situations. We have doctors trained in pediatric sexual abuse examinations. They're gentle, they're thorough, and they document everything in a way that will hold up in court. I know it's frightening, but it's necessary." Jasmine looked up at me with terrified eyes. "Will it hurt, Grandma?" "No, baby," I said, though I had no idea if that was true. "And I'll be right there with you the whole time. I promise." We went to the Child Advocacy Center that same evening. It was a building designed to look less clinical and more welcoming, with soft colors and comfortable furniture and artwork on the walls made by children. But no amount of cheerful decoration could hide what this place really was, a place where childhood innocence came to be documented after it had been stolen. Dr. Miriam Chen, a pediatrician who specialized in child abuse cases, conducted the examination with incredible gentleness and patience. She explained everything she was doing before she did it. She let Jasmine hold my hand through the entire process. And when it was over, she came to speak with me privately, while a nurse stayed with Jasmine. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, and I could see the sadness and anger in her professional demeanor. The physical evidence is consistent with chronic sexual abuse over an extended period. There's scarring. There's evidence of repeated trauma. This child has been suffering for a long time. I felt my knees buckle again, and Dr. Chen guided me to a chair. "Will she be okay?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Will she recover from this? With time, with therapy, with a safe environment and people who believe her and support her, yes, children can heal from this, but it's going to be a long road. And right now, the most important thing is that she has you. She has someone who believed her when her own mother didn't." We returned to my house late that evening, exhausted and traumatized, but knowing we'd taken the first steps toward justice. Jasmine was quiet, drained from reliving her trauma through testimony and examination, but there was something different in her eyes now. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the faintest glimmer of hope, the understanding that someone finally believed her, that she wasn't alone anymore. I made her a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that she picked at without much appetite. I tucked her into the guest bedroom, the room that had been waiting for her visits, but now might become her permanent home, and sat with her until she fell into an exhausted sleep. Detective Williams called me around 9 that night with an update. "Mrs. Montgomery, we've coordinated with law enforcement in Atlanta. They're going to locate Darnell at his hotel and arrest him tomorrow morning. We didn't want to give him any warning, any chance to destroy evidence or flee. We have enough to charge him with multiple counts of child sexual abuse, and with Jasmine's testimony and the medical evidence, we have a very strong case." "What about my daughter?" I asked, the question I'd been dreading. "Does Naomi have to know?" "Mrs. Montgomery, your daughter absolutely has to know. In fact, we need to speak with her as part of our investigation. According to Jasmine, she reported the abuse to her mother 3 months ago and was not believed. That's something we need to document. Depending on the circumstances, your daughter could potentially face charges herself for failure to protect." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own daughter, facing criminal charges for not protecting her child. Part of me wanted to defend her, to make excuses, to say she'd been manipulated by Darnell's charm and lies. But another part of me, the part that had heard Jasmine's broken voice on that recording, felt she deserved whatever consequences came her way. "I'll call her," I said quietly. "I'll tell her she needs to come to my house." The call to Naomi was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She was at the hospital, in the middle of her shift, and she sounded irritated when she answered. "Mama, I'm working. What is it? You need to come to my house as soon as your shift ends. It's about Jasmine. It's urgent. Is she sick? What happened? Why isn't she at home?" Naomi's voice shifted from irritation to concern. "Just come, Naomi. We need to talk. It can't wait." She arrived at my house at 6 the next morning, still in her scrubs, her face lined with exhaustion from her 12-hour night shift. I met her at the door, blocking her way, not inviting her in immediately. "Where's Jasmine? What's going on?" she demanded. "Is she okay?" "No, Naomi. She's not okay. She hasn't been okay for 2 years. But you didn't care enough to find out the truth." Naomi's face went pale. "What are you talking about? Mama, what's happening?" "Come inside," I said coldly, opening the door. Jasmine was still asleep upstairs, and I wanted to keep it that way. We sat in my living room, and I explained everything as calmly as I could manage. The state Jasmine had been in when I picked her up from school, the recording she'd made, the police investigation, the medical examination, the evidence of chronic sexual abuse, Darnell's arrest that would be happening within hours. Naomi's face went through a progression of emotions: shock, disbelief, denial, and finally, a dawning horror as the truth she'd refused to see finally became unavoidable. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible. Darnell would never. He's a good man. He's been good to us. He provides for us. He's been raping your daughter for 2 years. I said bluntly, my voice hard. And she told you 3 months ago, and you called her a liar. Naomi's face crumpled. She was always so difficult about Darnell. She never accepted him. She was always saying bad things about him, trying to make me choose between them. I thought she was just acting out because she wanted Andre back. So instead of investigating, instead of taking her seriously, instead of protecting your child, you chose your husband over your daughter. The accusation hung in the air between us like poison. I didn't know, Naomi said, tears starting to stream down her face. I didn't know it was real. I thought she was making it up. You didn't want to know, I corrected her, because knowing would have meant your perfect new life with your professional husband was built on a lie. It would have meant admitting you'd brought a monster into your home. Mama, please, Naomi sobbed. I made a mistake. I should have listened. I should have believed her, but I didn't know. You didn't want to know, I repeated. And that might be the worst part of all of this. Your daughter came to you for help, and you turned her away. You left her alone with a predator. You chose him over her. What have I done? Naomi whispered, burying her face in her hands. What have I done to my baby? What you've done, I said coldly, is something you'll have to live with for the rest of your life. Jasmine might forgive you someday, though I don't know if I would. But right now, she's staying with me. The police want to talk to you about your failure to report, and you need to decide if you're going to support your daughter through this or continue to make excuses. Detective Williams arrived at my house an hour later to interview Naomi. I sat with them, listening as my daughter, between sobs and broken apologies, admitted that Jasmine had told her about the abuse, that she'd dismissed it as lies and attention-seeking, that she'd been so desperate to keep her marriage intact that she'd sacrificed her daughter's safety. The detective's face remained professionally neutral, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. Mrs. Jenkins, I need to be clear with you. What you're describing could constitute criminal neglect. The district attorney will decide whether to file charges against you. In the meantime, Child Protective Services will be involved. Jasmine will not be returning to your custody. Naomi looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes. Mama, please. Tell them I didn't know. Tell them I would never hurt Jasmine intentionally. You did hurt her, I said quietly. Not intentionally, maybe, but you hurt her by not believing her. And now you have to face the consequences of that. The news about Darnell's arrest spread through Charlotte like wildfire. By afternoon, it was all over the local news stations. They showed footage of him being walked out of an Atlanta hotel in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his carefully groomed hair disheveled, his head bowed as reporters shouted questions at him. The headlines were brutal. Charlotte pharmaceutical rep arrested for child sex abuse and stepfather accused of years of abuse. Social media exploded with outrage and disgust. People who'd worked with Darnell, who'd known him as the polished professional with the smooth smile, were posting about their shock and horror. His company released a statement immediately terminating his employment. Former neighbors and acquaintances were sharing their stories about how they'd always thought something was off about him, though none of them had said anything at the time. I sat in front of my television with my fists clenched, watching the coverage, feeling a mixture of satisfaction that he was being exposed and fury that it had taken so long, that my granddaughter had suffered for 2 years before justice began. Jasmine woke up from her nap and came downstairs, seeing the news on the television. She stopped in the doorway, staring at the image of Darnell in handcuffs. "Is he going to jail, Grandma?" she asked quietly. "Yes, baby. He's going to jail for a very long time. He's never going to hurt you again." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Good. I hope he suffers like he made me suffer." The words, so full of justified anger from such a young child, broke my heart all over again. Child Protective Services came to my house the next day, a social worker named Mrs. Patricia Green interviewed both Jasmine and me, assessed my home, reviewed my background, and determined that I was a suitable placement for Jasmine while the case proceeded. Mrs. Montgomery, based on what I've seen and heard, I'm recommending that Jasmine remain in your care. Her mother is not currently considered a safe placement due to her failure to protect when abuse was reported. I felt relief wash over me. She can stay with me as long as she needs to. Forever, if that's what it takes. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom with Jasmine beside me, holding her hand, feeling her trembling despite the brave face she was trying to maintain. Darnell was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his appearance a shocking contrast to the polished businessman I'd known. He looked diminished somehow, stripped of the expensive suits and smooth charm that had hidden his true nature. He kept his eyes down, never once looking at Jasmine, perhaps knowing that meeting her gaze would be an admission of his guilt that even his lawyers couldn't spin. The prosecution presented their evidence: Jasmine's testimony, the recording, the medical examination results, documentation from the police investigation. Darnell's lawyer, an expensive defense attorney his family had hired, tried to argue that the recording was unclear, that children's memories are unreliable, that there could be other explanations for the medical findings. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Reynolds, listened to everything with an impassive face that revealed nothing. When it was time for her ruling, she looked directly at Darnell with unconcealed disgust. "Mr. Jenkins, based on the evidence presented, there is more than sufficient cause to bind you over for trial on multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor. You will remain in custody without bail as you pose a flight risk and a danger to the community, particularly to children." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Darnell's mother, sitting in the back row, let out a sob. His father sat stone-faced, staring at his son, as if he didn't recognize him. Naomi was sitting several rows behind us, having been barred from sitting with Jasmine by CPS guidelines. I could hear her quiet crying, but I didn't turn around. My focus was entirely on Jasmine, on making sure she felt supported and protected through this ordeal. As we left the courthouse, a crowd of reporters swarmed us, shouting questions, trying to get Jasmine's face on camera. Detective Williams and several officers formed a protective barrier around us, getting us to my car without incident. "Vultures," I muttered, buckling Jasmine into the back seat. The trial itself was scheduled for 3 months later. Those 3 months were some of the hardest of my life, watching Jasmine struggle with nightmares, with trauma responses, with the weight of what she'd endured. I enrolled her in therapy with Dr. Lisa Washington, a child psychologist who specialized in sexual abuse survivors. Twice a week, Jasmine went to those sessions, and slowly, incrementally, I began to see small improvements. The nightmares became less frequent. She started eating more regularly. She even laughed occasionally at something on television or at a joke I made. Andre, her biological father, came to Charlotte as soon as he heard what had happened. He'd been working in Raleigh, trying to pay off his debts, but he dropped everything and drove the 3 hours to see his daughter. When Jasmine saw him walk through my door, she ran to him and collapsed in his arms, sobbing, "Daddy, Daddy." I tried to tell Mama, but she didn't believe me. "I know, baby girl," Andre said, his own voice breaking as he held her. "I know, and I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm so sorry I let you down." He looked at me over Jasmine's head, tears streaming down his face. "Miss Clara, thank you for saving her. Thank you for being the one who believed her." Andre started coming to Charlotte every weekend, making the drive from Raleigh on Friday evenings and staying until Sunday night. He'd sleep on my couch, spend his days with Jasmine, taking her to the park, helping her with homework, cooking meals with us, slowly rebuilding the father-daughter relationship that distance and divorce had strained. I watched them together and saw Jasmine coming back to life, saw her smile return gradually, saw her begin to trust again. "I've paid off most of my debts," Andre told me one evening while Jasmine was upstairs taking a bath. "I'm looking at jobs back here in Charlotte. I want to be close to her. I should have been here all along." "You're here now," I said. "That's what matters." The trial began on a cold January morning. The courtroom was packed with people, reporters, concerned citizens, advocates from children's protection organizations. Darnell sat at the defense table in a suit his lawyers had dressed him in, trying to make him look respectable and harmless. But everyone in that room knew what he was. The prosecution built their case methodically over 5 days. They played the recording, and you could see people in the courtroom flinching, some crying, as they heard Darnell's voice calmly instructing a terrified child. They presented the medical evidence with Dr. Miriam Chen testifying about the physical trauma Jasmine had endured. They brought in expert witnesses on child sexual abuse who explained grooming behaviors and how predators operate. And then Jasmine testified. She was allowed to do it via closed-circuit television so she wouldn't have to face Darnell directly, but I knew how much courage it took for her to tell her story again, to relive those horrible experiences in front of strangers. I sat in the witness room with her, holding her hand, as she answered the prosecutor's questions with quiet bravery. "Can you tell the court what Mr. Jenkins did to you?" the prosecutor asked gently. And Jasmine, in a steady voice that made me so proud I could barely contain it, told the truth. All of it, every horrible detail. When she was finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The defense tried their best. They suggested Jasmine had been coached by me, that she'd fabricated the story because she resented Darnell for replacing her father, that the recording was taken out of context. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Darnell Eugene Jenkins, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel for order, but even she looked satisfied. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Reynolds looked down at Darnell from her bench with cold fury in her eyes. "Mr. Jenkins, you violated the trust placed in you as a stepfather. You preyed upon a vulnerable child for your own sick gratification. You robbed her of her innocence, her sense of safety, her childhood. The law allows me to sentence you to up to 25 years on each count, to run consecutively. And that is exactly what I'm going to do. You will serve 75 years in state prison without possibility of parole. You will register as a sex offender for life, should you ever be released. And I hope that every single day you spend behind bars, you think about the child whose life you tried to destroy." 75 years. Darnell was 38 years old. He would likely die in prison. As they led him away in chains, he finally looked back at where we were sitting. His eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw no remorse there, only anger at being caught. I stared back at him with all the fury and contempt I felt, wanting him to know that we had won, that Jasmine had won, that his victim had defeated him. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us again, but this time Detective Williams had arranged for us to make a brief statement. I stood at the microphone with Jasmine beside me, my arm around her shoulders protectively. "Today justice was served," I said, my voice steady and strong. My granddaughter showed incredible courage in coming forward and telling her truth. I want every child who's suffering in silence to know that your voice matters, your truth matters, and there are people who will believe you and fight for you. I also want to say to every parent, believe your children when they tell you something is wrong. Don't ignore the signs. Don't choose your comfort over their safety. My daughter made that mistake, and she has to live with it forever. Don't let that be your story." Jasmine squeezed my hand, and when I looked down at her, she was crying but also smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." We went home that day, leaving the courthouse and the reporters and the weight of the trial behind us. Jasmine's healing journey was far from over. I knew that. The trauma she'd experienced would take years to process, would probably affect her for the rest of her life in ways we couldn't yet predict. But she was safe now. She was believed. She was loved. And she was beginning to reclaim the childhood that Darnell had tried to steal. Naomi became the focus of public criticism after the trial ended. The newspapers and social media were brutal, calling her the mother who chose her husband over her child and the woman who ignored her daughter's cries for help. Neighbors who'd known her for years now avoided her on the street. Her colleagues at the hospital whispered when she walked by. Someone spray-painted child abuser on her garage door, and she had to hire someone to clean it off. I heard about all of this secondhand because Naomi and I were barely speaking. She'd call me sometimes, crying, begging to see Jasmine, apologizing over and over again. "Mama, please." I made a terrible mistake. I should have believed her. I should have protected her. But I love her. She's my daughter. Please let me see her. "She doesn't want to see you," I would tell her, which was the truth. Jasmine had made it very clear that she wasn't ready to face her mother, wasn't ready to forgive the woman who had chosen her abuser over her own child. "She needs time, Naomi, more time than you think. Maybe someday she'll be ready, but that's her decision, not mine." The district attorney's office had ultimately decided not to file criminal charges against Naomi, concluding that while her failure to protect was reprehensible, it didn't quite meet the legal threshold for criminal negligence. But the social consequences were punishment enough. Naomi lost custody of Jasmine entirely, with all parental rights suspended pending completion of a court-ordered parenting program and extensive therapy. Jasmine moved into my house permanently. The small guest bedroom that had once been for occasional sleepovers became her room, decorated with posters of her favorite singers and athletes, filled with her books and toys and clothes. We established routines together. I walked her to school every morning, picked her up every afternoon. We did homework at the kitchen table. We cooked dinner together. We watched television in the evenings. Slowly, my house that had felt so empty since Robert died was filled with life and laughter again, though always tinged with the awareness of what we'd been through, what Jasmine was still processing. Dr. Washington, her therapist, helped Jasmine work through the trauma in age-appropriate ways. Art therapy, where Jasmine drew pictures of her feelings. Play therapy, where she acted out scenarios with dolls and toys. Cognitive behavioral therapy, to help her develop coping mechanisms for the anxiety and fear that still sometimes overwhelmed her. After 6 months of therapy, Dr. Washington told me that Jasmine was making remarkable progress. "She's resilient," the therapist said. "More resilient than most adults would be in her situation. But she's going to need ongoing support for years, maybe for the rest of her life. The trauma of child sexual abuse doesn't just go away." Andre moved back to Charlotte permanently 8 months after the trial. He'd found a job as a maintenance supervisor at a hotel, nothing fancy but steady work with decent pay. He rented a small apartment just 10 blocks from my house and petitioned the court for visitation rights, which were granted given that he'd never been accused of any abuse and had been absent only due to financial struggles, not abandonment. Every Wednesday evening and every other weekend, Jasmine stayed with Andre. I was nervous the first time she went, worried about letting her out of my sight after everything that had happened, but I also knew she needed her father, needed to rebuild that relationship. And it was good for her. Andre was patient and gentle, never pushing her to talk about what had happened unless she brought it up, just being present and loving and stable in a way he hadn't been able to be when his gambling debts had consumed his life. "Miss Clara, I'm a different man now," he told me once when he brought Jasmine back from a weekend visit. What happened to Jasmine, knowing I wasn't there to protect her, it changed me. I'll never let her down again. I believed him. People could change, I'd learned. Some people, anyway, the good ones who wanted to do better. Jasmine started thriving in ways I hadn't dared hope for. She made friends at school, joining the art club and the school choir. Her teachers remarked on how bright and engaged she was, how kind she was to other students, especially to kids who seemed lonely or left out. "It's like she has this deep empathy," her fourth-grade teacher told me at a parent-teacher conference. "Like she understands suffering in a way most children her age don't." It was true. Jasmine's trauma had given her a sensitivity to others' pain, a desire to help and protect that was beautiful, even though it had been born from something so ugly. One afternoon, almost a year after Darnell's conviction, Jasmine came home from school and found me in the kitchen preparing dinner. She stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment, before speaking. "Grandma, I've been thinking. Maybe I'm ready to see Mama." I set down the knife I was using to chop vegetables and turned to face her. "Are you sure, baby? You don't have to do this if you're not ready. There's no rush." "I know," Jasmine said. "But Dr. Washington says that forgiveness isn't for the other person. It's for me, so I can let go of the anger and move forward. I don't know if I can forgive Mama yet, but I think I want to try to understand why she didn't believe me." We arranged a supervised visit at Dr. Washington's office, with the therapist present to mediate and ensure Jasmine felt safe. Naomi arrived looking thin and exhausted, the weight of the past year clearly visible in her face. When she saw Jasmine, she started crying immediately. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Jasmine stood there, looking at her mother, with an expression that was part pain, part confusion, part residual love. "Why didn't you believe me, Mama? I told you he was hurting me. Why did you call me a liar?" Naomi sat down, her hands trembling in her lap, and tried to find words adequate to explain the inexplicable. "I was scared," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared that if what you were saying was true, it meant I'd made a terrible mistake marrying Darnell. It meant I'd brought a monster into our home. It meant I'd failed as a mother. And I was so desperate to believe that my life was finally working out, that I'd found stability and security after the chaos with your father's gambling, that I convinced myself you were lying. I chose to believe the life I wanted instead of the truth you were trying to tell me. But I'm your daughter," Jasmine said, her voice breaking. "I needed you to protect me. That was your job." "You're right," Naomi said, tears streaming down her face. "That was my job, and I failed. I failed you in the worst possible way, and I will have to live with that for the rest of my life. Every single day, I wake up knowing that you suffered because I didn't believe you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm trying to become the mother you deserved all along." The conversation was painful and difficult, with long silences and more tears from both of them. Dr. Washington guided them gently, helping them communicate without attacking, helping Jasmine express her pain without being re-traumatized. By the end of the session, nothing was resolved, but something had begun. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of understanding. Over the next months, Jasmine and Naomi met regularly at Dr. Washington's office. Slowly, tentatively, they began rebuilding something that looked like a relationship, though it would never be what it had been before. Trust, once broken so completely, could perhaps be mended, but never fully restored. Naomi completed her court-ordered parenting classes and therapy. She learned about child sexual abuse, about warning signs she'd missed, about how predators manipulate entire families. She learned about the importance of believing children, about creating safe environments for disclosure, about putting children's needs above adult comfort. She became an advocate, speaking at schools and community centers about her experience, warning other parents not to make the mistakes she'd made. "I was the mother who didn't believe," she would say in these talks, her voice heavy with regret. "I was the mother who chose my happiness over my daughter's safety. Don't be me. Believe your children. Protect them first, ask questions later." It was her penance, this public acknowledgement of her failure, this warning to others. It didn't undo what had happened to Jasmine, but maybe it prevented other children from suffering. 2 years after Darnell's conviction, on Jasmine's 11th birthday, we had a small party at my house. Andre was there, and his new girlfriend Melissa, who Jasmine really liked. Some of Jasmine's school friends came, and Naomi came too, bringing a cake she'd baked herself, Jasmine's favorite chocolate cake with vanilla frosting. Jasmine blew out her candles, surrounded by people who loved her and had proven they would protect her. As I watched her laughing with her friends, saw the joy on her face, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before that terrible day when she'd handed me the recording. She was healing. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely healing. That evening, after everyone had left and Jasmine was in bed, I sat on my porch in the cool North Carolina spring air and thought about everything we'd been through. The horror of discovering the abuse. The rage at Darnell and at Naomi. The long process of justice. The even longer process of healing. I thought about the moment I'd almost missed it all, when I'd almost convinced myself that Jasmine was just going through a phase, that nothing was really wrong. If I hadn't trusted my instincts that day, if I hadn't pushed when Jasmine broke down crying, if I hadn't believed her immediately and taken action, where would she be now? Still suffering in silence, still being victimized, still thinking no one would believe her. The thought made me cold despite the warm evening. As I sat there, Jasmine came out onto the porch in her pajamas. "Can't sleep, baby?" I asked, making room for her beside me on the swing. "I just wanted to say, thank you, Grandma," she said, curling up against me. "For believing me. For saving me. For giving me a safe place to heal. You don't need to thank me for that, sweet girl. That's what family does. Real family." "I know Mama's trying," Jasmine said quietly. "Dr. Washington says she's making progress. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive her completely. But even if I do, I'll always remember that you were the one who believed me first. You were the one who fought for me." I hugged her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heartbeat against my chest, this precious child who'd survived horrors no one should endure. "I'll always fight for you, Jasmine. Always. That's a promise." We sat there together in the evening quiet, grandmother and granddaughter, survivor and protector, two people who'd walked through fire and come out the other side scarred but stronger. The road ahead was still long. Jasmine would struggle with the trauma of her abuse for years to come. There would be setbacks and hard days and moments when the past tried to drag her back into darkness. But she had what every child deserves: people who believed her, people who protected her, people who loved her unconditionally. She had safety and therapy and support. She had a future that wasn't defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do despite it. My name is Clara Montgomery. I'm 65 years old. I'm a grandmother who saved her granddaughter from a monster who wore the mask of a respectable man. And if my story teaches anyone anything, I hope it's this: believe children when they tell you they're being hurt. Don't ignore the signs. Don't choose your comfort over their safety. Don't let shame or fear or denial prevent you from protecting the most vulnerable among us. Because somewhere right now, there's a child trying to find the courage to speak up about abuse. There's a child who needs an adult to believe them, to fight for them, to save them. Be that adult. Be the person who listens. Be the person who acts. Be the person who changes the trajectory of a child's life by simply believing their truth. Justice came for Darnell Jenkins in that Charlotte courtroom. But justice also came in the form of a grandmother who trusted her instincts, who believed her granddaughter without question, who fought through every obstacle to ensure that child was safe and heard and valued. That's the justice that matters most in the end. Not the sentence handed down by a judge, important as that is, but the healing that happens when a child knows they are believed, protected, and loved. Jasmine is 11 now. She's thriving in school. She has friends and hobbies and dreams for her future. She still sees Dr. Washington regularly. She's learning to trust again, to feel safe again, to reclaim the childhood that was stolen from her. And every single day, I thank God that I was there that afternoon, that I noticed something was wrong, that I listened when she finally found the courage to speak, because that's all it took to save her life. Just one person who believed. That is Clara Montgomery's story. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing our global community come together over these important stories about child protection, believing survivors, and the courage it takes to stand up against evil hiding in plain sight. Real question. If you were Clara, what would you have done when Jasmine came home from school crying? Would you have pushed for answers immediately? Would you have called the police right away? Or would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments. Hit that like button if this story made you feel something. Share it if you know someone who works with children, who's a parent, who needs to understand the warning signs of abuse. Share it if you believe that every child deserves to be believed when they speak up about being hurt. And subscribe for more raw, real stories about grandmothers who save their grandchildren, mothers who fail to protect and must face the consequences, predators who hide behind respectable facades, and the brave survivors who find the courage to speak their truth, even when no one wants to hear it. This story is difficult. It's painful. It deals with the worst kind of betrayal and the darkest kind of evil. But it also shows the power of one person who chooses to believe, to act, to fight for a child who has no one else. Thanks for watching. Remember, children rarely lie about abuse. When a child tells you something is wrong, believe them first and investigate later. Don't let your comfort, your denial, or your desire to keep the peace prevent you from protecting a child. The warning signs are there if we're willing to see them. The voices are there if we're willing to listen. Be the person who believes. Be the person who acts. Be the person who saves a child's life. And if you're a survivor of childhood abuse watching this, I want you to know it wasn't your fault. You deserved to be protected. You deserved to be believed. And it's never too late to seek help, to heal, to reclaim your life from the people who tried to destroy it. See you in the next video.